Mic set up. All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is, I still need my wake-up call. So, first session in the morning, second day of the conference. I'll get you good and started, and then you'll be excited for the rest of the day, the rest of the camp, and we're good to go. So today we're going to be talking about mostly containers, containerization, the very concept of it, using Docker. How many people here have used Docker at all before? Okay, so a good number of people. And people familiar, having used like virtual machines in the past, like VirtualBox, like everybody's a virtual machine at some point, right? All right, so I'm going to discuss a little bit of the difference between, kind of at a high level, the difference between virtual machines and Docker containers, and containerization in general. And then I just kind of go into Doxil, which is this open source product that we've made at FFW for actually managing containers. So that's really the whole point of it, is to not just show what you can do with containers, because anybody's a sysadmin can kind of figure that out in an afternoon. But for most people, it's still a difficult kind of thing to sort of manage them and actually make it something that's usable as part of your workflow and your development environments and stuff like that. So there's a number of different tools that people have made to sort of make that a little bit easier. And Doxil is the one that we've made at FFW that we use internally. And it's pretty much based around really just being easy for users, as opposed to something that is purely something that's for like senior developers and sysadmins and stuff like that. Our real main use case are junior developers, themers, QA staff, people like that. So we work very heavily on something that's very easy for people to set up and use, get started with right away. All right, so as I said, I'm David Hernandez. I'm manager of learning contributions at FFW. What that means is I do a lot of development client work, but I'm also one of the lead trainers. So I do a lot of presentations, do internal training, I do training for clients, free public trainings as well. So if you go to our website, you can see a lot of the free public trainings and webinars that we actually do. So feel free to sign up for those. We also have a booth here upstairs, so I'll be at later today. So feel free to stop by if you want to find out more and just talk to me or get some materials, things like that. You can find me at Drupal.org as David Hernandez, all one word, and on Twitter as David Morales. So feel free to tweet me if you have any questions or need anything. I'm one of those people where I'm not really concerned when people reach out and they want to get a hold of me and ask me questions and things like that. Okay, so I like to start all my presentations with sort of a problem statement, right? Like, what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish here, and what problems are we solving? Because we work in technology, but technology to me is not all that useful if it's not actually solving problems and trying to. So, project onboarding is a major issue for us. We have large development staff. We have lots of teams. We have lots of different people in different positions. And if you're dealing with contractors, you have people who come in and out. We deal with lots of clients that are large, and they have their own development staff, and they have people that go in and out in projects. So it's always an issue for us. Like, how do you onboard people to a project? Right, so there's all these different ways how you can set up a project. We know some people have different local development environments. Projects are set up in weird ways. They have different services, different things that they need. And some projects, I've had this experience where it takes you an entire day just to onboard, because you've got to set up some virtual machine. There's some build process involved in that. You've got to make sure you get it done right. You've got to get a phone call with the team lead, and he tells you how to set it up. And like, no, you got to go to this service to get the database that needs to be imported and do this and all this sort of stuff that you need to do, just so that you might want to spend like half an hour working on some problem, like a bug, or like, hey, can we bring this guy in and look at this problem for us? And it takes him like 10 hours just to get the project set up so that he can look at it, right? That's a problem. And now imagine you do the same thing with somebody who's like a themer. Like, I want you to work on this project for us. You don't have any of the skill sets to do this kind of stuff, and you don't want to, and that's totally acceptable. You shouldn't need to be a sysadmin just to theme a Drupal site, but they have to go through that whole same process. And that's really a big problem for somebody like us who's kind of large. And I think, honestly, it's a problem for anybody. Like, even if you're in a small organization, you want to bring somebody in, you have people who only have certain skill sets, and it just becomes a big issue, right? And then what always happens, like, somebody's going to build that whole thing, and then they document it, and then like 5 minutes later, that documentation is not even relevant anymore because they modified something, and nobody ever keeps the documentation up to date, and they go, read the wiki, and they read the wiki, and it doesn't work, and I get this error, and then spend 2 days trying to figure that out. It's a pain. Right? And And I've actually had this last problem all the time. Like, it works fine on my local. Like, well, why are you using a different version of PHP than everybody else is using? Or like, why are your services slightly different than everybody else's? Nobody's consistent. Nobody has the same development environment. Works fine. You try to deploy it someplace else, and it doesn't work. And now, like on your build server, your dev server, you get this error, but you don't get it on your local machine because none of your services are the same, right? So you've got no consistency wherever this actual website's going. All right, so for us at FFW, this is our onboarding process. We have no documentation. There is no wiki. We basically just tell somebody, you clone this repo, you run this one command, init, to initialize the project, and then that's it. So if somebody moves from one project to another, somebody gets pulled in as a contractor, we work with a client, whatever, 2 commands, that's all they have to do, and everything else is done. And I'm going to show you how to actually do this. So once you get through these slides, I'll actually do some demos, and I'll show you how easy it is to actually do these things. All right. So a little bit of background, fundamental differences. So a lot of you are familiar with using virtual machines, probably use like VirtualBox or something like that. And the real difference here is that virtual machines are trying to do essentially full hardware virtualization. It's trying to mimic an entire computer and install an operating system on it, configure that operating system, install all the services, do everything that you need to make that thing work. Which kind of sucks in a way if all you're doing is like trying to run one thing, right? So if that machine just needs to have like MySQL on it, you need everything in the entire stack just to get to a point where MySQL will run. So if you want to separate your services or have different projects, right? And then like this project has this version of MySQL, and another project has another version of MySQL, and like what are you going to do? Run out like 2 different virtual machines, and then you need that entire stack, the full hardware virtualization and everything, just to have these 2 different things. Containers don't work that way. Containers basically reuse the host operating system that they're running on, right? So this is something that's really Linux-based. It's built into the Linux kernel. So if you create a container, it's really just a small unit that if it's running MySQL or if it's running Apache or whatever, it literally just contains the binaries and libraries necessary to run that thing. So it can just run MySQL, and it doesn't need anything else that's part of the operating system. That operating system that it uses is the host operating system that it's on, right? So if it's running on a Linux machine, it reuses the kernel that's on that machine, right? So the container itself doesn't have to have the Linux kernel in it, and it doesn't have to have all these other services that might be necessary to like do disk management and set up users and like all the kind of stuff that an operating system would have. The container has none of that, and it doesn't need any of it. So that's why the container is really small, it's very fast, it's very light. You can start them up and shut them down very quickly. They're not big, they don't suck up a lot of resources. You can have multiple ones of them, and you can do all kinds of amazing things because all they really need is just whatever that finite little bit of service is necessary for just that one thing. Okay? So graphically, this is the same thing that I just explained. So on the left is basically what you're getting with virtual machines. So if you tried to actually separate all your services as virtual machines, and if you think of the normal stack that we're talking about as web developers, we would have like a separate one that is the web server, and a separate one that is the database server, and a separate one that's doing something else. Each one of those would have to fully utilize this guest operating system, and then whatever libraries it needs to run the application. So you end up with this full stack just to do that one thing, and then rinse and repeat every time for all the other different services that you want. So then you have a project with like Solar or Varnish or something else. Well, then you'd have to have another virtual machine and then install Solar in it and then get it all up and running, and you're repeating that entire stack. But with containers, it's what we get on the right over here, where essentially you have your infrastructure, which would be like your servers, my laptop, whatever it is. And then since we use Docker, we get this Docker engine, which is just software. And then above that, for each container, all you need is just what that app needs to run, and that's it. So you imagine each one of these things, like app 1 is just MySQL. And literally what's in that container is like MySQL, and that's it. Right? So that's what makes this actually really easy. If you actually have never done this before, I recommend going ahead and doing it. Like go get like a how-to on how to do Docker real quick. You can actually do it pretty quickly in like 10 minutes. I didn't realize before I ever did it how easy it was. I thought it was like the same thing. Like I gotta configure all this stuff and download all these things and figure out how to like completely build an image to make these containers and stuff like that. You actually don't. And the really cool thing is that containers can chain. So if you can find a container that already does what you want and you have to make slight modifications to it, in like your configuration file, you just add sort of the changes that you want to make. You don't have to like rebuild and configure the whole thing and all this stuff. It's actually much easier to do than you may realize if you've never done it before. Okay? Okay, so then kind of the same thing. So imagine like this is a system that you're dealing with and you have to worry about resource management. So say you've got some cloud infrastructure and you've got servers and stuff like that, and you're dealing strictly with virtual machines, you end up in a situation where you have to worry about how you reserve these virtual machines. And then you're starting to think about things like what CPUs you're using and the number of cores and things like that, because that actually matters when you're setting up virtual machines, because you can run out of them. Right, and so you might set up one virtual machine that only uses a little bit of stuff, but it actually sucks up a lot of resources because you have to reserve basically everything for it. But when you're dealing with containers, it's kind of an opposite situation. You can just think about only what you need to reserve for that particular app, that particular service. That's it. And you can have so many of them. You can start them up. You can shut them down. You can ditch them. You can do whatever you want. You're not worried. These things don't function like an actual computer or server or anything like that. They just function like little apps. So you can just create as many as you want and tear them down, do anything that you need. All right, so from a resource management standpoint, it's much more efficient. Okay, so this is sort of the transition that we would look at. Again, this is just reinforcing the same point. On the left, if you do this as a virtual machine, this is what you would get. You'd create this one box that is the virtual machine. You might have multiple services in it. But if you're doing it as containers, you'd have individual containers for each one of those things. So when I start demonstrating Doxil for you and how we do container management with it, what you'll see is you get multiple containers. So you start up a project. A project is not one container. A project will be like 2 or 3 or 4 containers, and each one of the containers is just a different service. Right? So one of them has MySQL in it, and one of them has the web server in it. And if you're using Solar, there'll be a container that has Solar in it. If you're using Varnish, there'll be a container that has Varnish in it. If you're using Elasticsearch, there'll be a container that has Elasticsearch in it. If you want to do Node.js, you can make a Node.js container. You can just pretty much add whatever services that you want, and it really doesn't matter, because you don't have to think of it as like, oh, well, I'm adding like a 4th server now to this project. Right? That doesn't matter, because you don't have to worry about the same sort of resource allocation that you would do if you were dealing with virtual machines. Okay. So, what are the pros of using containers? They're more efficient, they're more flexible, they're consistent in their usage, because you're not dealing with some sort of build process where somebody set up a server and had to fully configure it and deal with all those little minute things related to how you set up a server. Each container is just that individual service, and it tends to be really clean and really discrete. And so because you get into a habit of kind of like starting them and trashing them all the time, it's a very consistent experience, because when they run, they're basically the same thing. And you don't worry about things like the state of the container, right? You would just trash it and you build another one. So if there are any problems, that's normally what would happen. And then you don't have to worry about things like like I said, the MySQL container doesn't have things in it related to like how you really configure the operating system, right? So you don't have to go through like this big like Ansible or Puppet build script or anything. And people do that now with like virtual machines. Somebody's got like, oh, just type this one command, and then you sit there and you watch this wall of text go by with like this big giant like Ansible build, and then half the time it has messages that pop up in red, and you don't know what the hell happened, and it goes off the top of the screen, and then you can't remember anymore.
You'll find out.
And then you think it works, and then 2 days later, like, hey, that import doesn't work anymore. Oh, I should go back and look at that. Oh, I'll just rebuild it again, and I'll just go get coffee and come back in 20 minutes.
Log files.
Yeah. And then portability is another great thing. So as long as you have a place where you can run the containers, you can put them there. It really doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about things like, is this going to be supported in that location, yada, yada, yada. If you basically have a Linux server, you can put containers on it. And there's not a lot of particulars that you have to worry about from the based host operating system, things like that. So we actually use it as part of our build process. So we have build servers and development servers and servers like in the cloud, AWS, things like that, where we can install Doxil on it. And then the same configuration we use locally, we set up on that server. So if we want to build, it builds it there. It uses the exact same containers that I'm using on my laptop. So I know the environment is exactly the same. Same versions of PHP, the same MySQL being used, web servers set up the same way.
What are you using on Amazon? Is that the container service they provide, or is it EC2?
I don't actually know. It's probably EC2. I can get those details. I haven't actually set it up. So
That's what I'm asking.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Doxil. So the whole point of Doxil is all this stuff that I'm describing about using Docker and containers and things like that. You can do it all yourself. And I've done it, and plenty of people will just locally build their own containers and start them up and set up web servers. It's not that difficult. But there's all that periphery stuff that's really difficult to manage and kind of a pain, right? So like, you can set up a container, but then will your laptop and your web browser actually map itself to that web server? And like, do you have to go through the configurations and the firewall to set up that kind of stuff? And like, you have to do all that stuff yourself, and that's annoying, right? So if you don't have the skill set to be a sysadmin and do that kind of thing, it's really tedious. And it often becomes that situation where even if you can figure out how to do it, you do it that one time and then you never touch it, because you know it's going to break at some point and you forget how you did it. So then like 2 years later, if you're still on the same laptop, it's set up the exact same way and nothing changes because you don't want it to change, because you don't remember how to do it again, and it took you like half an hour to like just figure out the documentation. Right, so we want to make something to just make that easier, right? So we can just type a command, start stuff up, shut stuff down, do all this sort of stuff. Right. All right, so here's just quick setup info if you want to do this yourself. We actually have this URL, get.doxil.io, that you can go to, and it will download an installer for you. We also have a portable installer, so like you can put it on a flash drive. That's really handy for us, because like when we go do training and things like that, I can actually have it on a flash drive. I don't need internet access. And if you go to, we have Doxil in GitHub, so if you go there and check the documentation, we also have a documentation website. You can go through all that information. And it'll tell you how to set it up. It's actually pretty easy. You can run a command. There's a couple. It'll tell you like install VirtualBox or something, and then run a command. And it'll just do the setup for you. It's not too complicated.
So Doxil has its own VM for.
Yeah. So the difference here is, so if you're, all this is supported natively in Linux, so you don't need anything else. You can just install Doxil by itself. If you're on Mac or Windows, we have a VM. So I know it's kind of a joke. It's like, oh, VMs suck, but by the way, you need a VM. But it's simply because the support is not fully there yet for Mac and Windows. Mac has like a beta support for virtualization now, for containerization, and it is supported by Doxil, so if you want to use it, you can. I don't necessarily recommend it out of the box, just because it's still a little slow, essentially. So there's bugs they're working out, but just how it syncs the files back and forth between the two, and it's just a little, there's some
This is
lag.
a VM built by and for Doxil, right?
Yeah, so when you do the install, you don't have to set up a virtual machine. The only thing it's going to tell you to do is download VirtualBox, and then when you run the command, we have a VM that we maintain, that we built specifically for this, so it'll actually go download that VM, install it, set it up for you, all the port configurations, everything that you need. You don't have to do anything.
So if I'm running 4 Docker machines locally, like I have 4 sites, is it all using that same singleton VM?
Yes, everything will go into that one virtual machine.
Just about the native Docker for Mac, is that because the Mac uses a different kernel than Linux? Are those containers incompatible with Linux?
No, the containers are still compatible. That part doesn't matter. It's just the way they're setting up. Yeah, they have to build their own support because they have a different kernel, yes. But that's something that Apple built into the operating system, so they're doing that. And we support it. So the containers themselves don't matter. It's just if you actually set it up and run it, you might notice some lag between it syncing files and things like that, because it's just a little slow. So that's why I still tell people to use the VM. But I know people who are using it without the VM, and they're like, yeah, it's okay, it works fine for me, it's not too bad. But for other people who are like, oh, I've noticed some little slowness in certain things that I do, in certain operations, so we're like, we'll just use the VM, but it's fine. So this will install just a really thin Linux virtual machine in VirtualBox, and then when it does all the thing it does with the Docker containers, it puts them in that virtual machine, and they all actually run there. But you don't have to worry about setting anything up. Doxil just does it all for you.
When you say Windows, is this only a bunch of bash?
For the native?
Yeah. Or is it native Windows?
So I don't know that the native for Windows is even really ready for use yet. If it would be, it would have to be like in that bash that they have set up, that like mini fake kernel thing. But otherwise, it should be good. And we have, I would say, compared to a lot of other services that are similar to Doxil, we have pretty good Windows support. I would say we actually have really good Windows support. Because we actually have a lot of people internally that use Windows. As developers, our QA staff pretty much all use Windows. So it was one of the things we actually had to really work on, was making sure we had Windows support. Okay, so this is what the stack looks like. I just wanted to explain this part real quick, because there's a difference between Doxil the software and there's a command line tool that we have, and they work together. So when you see me run all these commands, you'll see me run fin, which is the name of the command. So the command's not actually called Doxil. All right, so when you get Doxil the software, it's essentially using Docker. It's using Docker Compose for configurations. You get a bunch of different containers that we maintain, but this is a fully extendable system. We basically, you don't try to reinvent the wheel. Right? We use as much of like native Docker stuff as possible. We don't try to build our own stuff. We're just making a tool that uses what already exists to make things easy for people. But we don't want it to be fully customized because we want people to understand how it works and have a similar experience. So like if you know how to do things in Docker and you use Doxil, you understand what it's doing. Like we use Docker Compose for the configurations, and that's a Docker thing. People who use Docker without this know what that is. And when they look at the configuration files, it looks exactly the same because it is exactly the same. So even when you're going to add customizations to it, if they're customizations that are already supported in Docker, Doxil sort of just natively supports them because we're not doing anything special in that way. And so it is fully extendable. Like we have containers that we support that we maintain, but you don't have to just use our container. So if you're thinking you want another service that we don't like have in our documentation or something, you don't need a container from us. You can just go to Docker Hub and use any container they have. So if you need like Node.js or something, you can go to Docker Hub and just use the Node.js container, add it to your configuration. It'll be there as part of your project.
Is there scope for private registries as well? So can I pull from like a private registry that we're hosting on site?
I think so. I'd have to double check.
Okay.
But I can get that information for you for sure. Yeah. Anyway, and it's agnostic, so it's not just for Drupal. This was a big thing for me when we started building it, because I didn't want it to just be a Drupal thing, and it's not. Right, so we use it with Drupal. I use it on my laptop. I've got Drupal 6, 7, and 8. I use it with WordPress projects. I use it with Node.js projects, Symfony apps, flat HTML sites, whatever you want. Basically, when you set up a project, it's just a directory with services running and a document root. Whatever you want to put in that document root is up to you. Whatever it is you want to get run in there is up to you. Whatever services you want to add is up to you. It doesn't matter. You want to use Solr, you don't want to use Solr, you want different versions of it with different projects. It really doesn't matter. They're all completely separate and they're all agnostic. For the most part, though, it is a PHP web app kind of thing. So our web container natively is going to be using a version specified of PHP. But like I said, I've used it with Node.js projects. It's not a big deal. You can make any changes you want, modify the configuration. It really doesn't care. Okay, and then fin, as I said, is the command line tool. So Docker is all the software, like the container managers, setting up the projects, all this sort of stuff. And then we have this command called fin that actually like runs the scripts and does stuff. So when you see me write commands, you'll see me there's fin space something, whatever that is. Right, so the comparison I make is like if Doxil is Drupal, fin is like Drush, essentially.
Does fin, is it a Drush wrapper? Can you run Drush commands with fin?
Yes, so, and I'll get to that. In our containers, like what we have is the CLI container. The CLI container is something that basically just has a bunch of stuff in it installed so that you can run commands, and it is the main thing that actually will talk to all the other containers that are in your project. And in that container, we have like Drush installed and Drupal console installed, and the WordPress CLI tools installed in there, and Composer's installed in there, and Ruby and NPM, and like all kinds of different things, and you can add stuff to it as well as you want. So like even if you've got like themes that you're building and you need Gulp or Bower or whatever, like we have a lot of those things already installed inside the container. So I run Composer through it as well, and that's the really nice thing is you don't have to have any of that stuff installed locally on your machine. You actually tell the command container to do it. Right, so that's how you make your projects portable to another system. Right, somebody else doesn't have to get all this stuff installed. Somebody else doesn't have to have whatever specific version of that Ruby gem installed and go through all that nonsense, making sure all these dependencies work right. You can basically have the command container do all that stuff for you, so that you just move all this stuff around wherever it is you need, and you know it's going to work. All right, so this is just a list of different commands that we have, like start and stop and processes. We can directly access the VM and tell it to do stuff like reboot if necessary. We have project aliasing, just like in Drush. So like if you're not in a project directory, but you want to run a command from outside of it or from another one, you can actually reference an alias and it'll run that command in that project. Just like Drush does with aliases. Direct access to MySQL, so if you want to do like quick and easy database imports and exports, if you want to directly access the MySQL server, just log into it. quick command to do that. So like you don't have to specify a username and password. It knows what the username and password is to connect to that service, and so it just logs you in right away. You can go into the database and do stuff. SSH commands logging. It has a self-update and it has share. For those of you who have used Doxil before, have you guys used the share command? Nobody? Nobody uses the share command. Nobody seems to know what it is. So I'm going to demonstrate the share command because it's really, really awesome. Basically, we use a service called ngrok where you can expose your website to the internet. So the website like I have on my laptop, I can expose it to the internet with a URL and give that URL to somebody, and they can access it on my laptop. So like if you need to like just show somebody something or like share it with a client, like, hey, here's the thing I'm working on right now. Look at this URL, and they will access the website on your laptop.
It's hot.
Nobody ever uses it. I mean, come on. Look at the documentation, people. Suddenly my laptop's not working. Here we go. All right. Really nice thing, zero configuration. This was an awesome thing that we set up a while ago. One thing I hate about a lot of these services is that they are harder to use than they claim to be, because you might set up a project, but there's always that situation where like, oh, but in order to set up a project, you need a configuration. So here, best practice, go get this file that we have that has the config in it, and just change this line that like sets whatever your URL is going to be or something, and go put it in this place. That's how do you do all this sort of stuff. But Doxil, you don't actually need that. We have a default config that it natively uses. So when you set up a project, you actually don't need a configuration at all. And I'll show you how to do that. You literally just tell Doxil to start in this directory, and you don't need any config. So you can literally get started with one command, that's it. But you can fully customize this. You're not locked into that config. You can actually write it to a directory or add your own custom configuration files and just modify them any way you want to tell it to do whatever it is that you want. But it just has that stuff by default so that you don't have to know how to use it. And by default, these are the services that it comes with. It'll assume that you need a web container, which has Apache, PHP, a database container, and this CLI container that has all this stuff installed in it, like Drush and Composer and Drupal console and all that kind of stuff. All right. Then we have like the ability to create custom commands. So if you look at our sample projects, there's usually this init command, and it's the thing that we use the most. And it's really just a bash script that tells Doxil what to do. So when you run it, it'll do things like, if you look at our sample projects like the Drupal 8 one, it actually does a bunch of things like copy the settings file over and make the files directory and then just do a Drush site install. And so like 2 minutes later, you go and look and you've got a Drupal 8 site set up. Stuff like that. So like when we actually work on projects, we use the init command all the time to sort of like rebuild the site at its original state. Right, so like if I'm making a module or I'm working on something and I need to test it, like I'll finish my code and then I'll go back to the command line and go fin init, and it'll actually like reinstall the site to get it back to where it was. So I can ensure that like I wasn't doing something funky in the site that's going to be different than anything anybody else is doing. And I do that kind of stuff like all the time, right? And that's something really hard to do if you're dealing with like a virtual machine with some sort of like build process, because you're not going to want to go back and do that if it takes you 15 minutes to get the site built back up again, right? But for me, I do it constantly because most of the time it takes me like less than 2 minutes to actually do it, right? So for a project we're actually working on, that command might actually be just, hey, drop the current database, re-import it because the database is located here, and then do like a config import on a Drupal 8 site. So that whole process takes like 30 seconds, right? So if I want to verify that like this thing actually works because I didn't forget to save some configuration or something like that, I can verify that before I actually commit my code and send it to somebody else. Right? It's really quick and easy, and it's awesome. All right, and then we have all these other commands that you can do. So like exec is actually a command that will take you directly into that command container. So if you wanted to tell it to do like normal bash stuff, like you could actually do like fin exec ls, and it'll like ls the directory. Like, it doesn't make sense, but you can do it if you want. And then if you do fin bash, it'll actually log you in. So if you want to log into the command container because you have to look at something and see what it's actually doing, like logging, like SSH into it, like a Linux server, it'll actually do that for you. You can just do fin bash. You don't have to worry about what the address is to get connected, what the username and password is, any of those details. You just do fin bash and it takes you right inside the container. You can just do stuff like troubleshoot. Okay, and then you can modify the configurations that you want at all. So what we basically will do, and I'll show you this, is that in order for a project to work, we create this .doxil directory in the project root, and then in there, most of the service configurations go in this doxil.yaml file. And that will look exactly like a Docker Compose file if you've ever seen what that looks for. It's just a YAML file that says, I use these services. So for any project, you can customize that in any way that you want. Okay? So recap, blah, blah, blah. It's awesome. Yay, it's great. I'm going to show you some demos. And then for more information, you can go to these URLs. Right, so we have a website, doxil.io. It's just going to point you to other stuff for the most part. Where you really can go is on GitHub, go to our Doxil account, and we have lots of stuff in there. So you'll get Doxil from there, but we also have sample projects for how you would do this with Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 and WordPress and Magento and Behat, and like we have all these different projects that we use. We have a QA suite in there that we use that has Behat and like Backstop in it, and Casper and Phantom.js and stuff like that that we use for actually testing. Like it doesn't actually have to set up a website. That's the other thing. These containers don't have to run a website. They could just be running services that you use for stuff, right? So you can like run your Behat test against an additional URL. It doesn't actually have to have something set up locally to do that. So that's pretty cool. Awesome, thank you. All right, so I'm going to show you how some of this stuff works. So I'm on command line here. I have a bunch of projects. Each one of them just gets a directory. Okay. Right, so and actually to set, I have Doxil installed. To set up a new project, this is all you have to do. Right, so I can just make a directory called webcom, cd webcom. Right, there's nothing in there. I will just make this .doxil directory. That's all you have to do. The reason you need a .doxil directory is that's the clue to Doxil that this is actually a project, as opposed to it being able to run any old place and it's like, oh, what the hell's going on? I don't know what's happening. So we just say like, all right, add the .doxil directory, and then we know that this is going to be a project. So when we tell it to like start services and stuff, it knows how to do that because it connects the location and the paths and all that sort of stuff. So if I do fin config, it will actually show me the default configuration. So I can start this up right now as a project, and this is the configuration that it's going to use. Right, so this is the services. It's going to use the CLI container, which is the one that does all the work. It's got a database container from MySQL. It's got a web container with Apache in it. Right, and then it's just got all these different configurations that you don't even have to know what they are. So then I'll just do fin up. And you can see now it's creating these services based on that default configuration. And when it's done, I will have an actual functioning website. Well, not actually functioning because there's nothing in it. Right. So right now, still, all I have is an empty directory. And an empty Doxil directory. There's literally no files or anything in there. If I go over here, I type govcon.doxil. That's the URL. So by default, if you don't give it a configuration, it will use what the directory name is. And you don't have to worry about doing like vhost configurations or going and editing your Etsy host file or all that kind of stuff that you normally do to get sites set up. You don't have to do any of that. We have a proxy that does everything for you. So if you don't specify anything, it'll assume the directory name of whatever project you're in, and then that's what the website's going to work on. So now, if you're smart and you know what's going on, you know that this not found error is actually coming from Apache. So we actually have a functioning website right now running through Apache, but it's not going to do anything because I don't have a directory that does anything. Right. So now I'm going to make a doc group. And if we're paying attention, we now get forbidden, and that works because now I have a doc root and it understands that, but there's nothing in the doc root, and it's not going to like list the directory structure for me. That's why I get a forbidden error. And then I can do something else. I'm going to add an index.php file with PHP info in it. And that's it. All right. So you see, I create that directory with a .doxil directory in it, one command fin up, and I have a fully functioning web server with everything in it. It's got a database server in it. It's got a username and password already set up with a default database in it. So you can, I could put Drupal in this directory and then run the installer, and just the username and password's like default or something that's already set up for me. So it takes you 2 seconds to do everything.
One question. So these files, can I go and find your, look and browse them that way, or are they all within, or do I have to view them exclusively via terminal?
Which files?
Any like files within the container. So if like I go into like the Finder app, will I be able to see like if I create an index? PHP?
Yeah, all these files I just made are local to my laptop.
Gotcha.
So I'm in my home directory right now.
Okay, I see.
Right, so I'm in David Project ScubCon.
Got
Right,
it.
so this is local on my laptop. If I was using a project repo, I would have Git in here, and like this
Got
is
it.
where my project would be checked out. So I'd have a .git directory, and everything would be copacetic. And that's usually what we have. And so now, if you want to make customizations to it, then what you can do is we can do thing config generate. And it'll actually now take that default config and write it into the Doxil directory. So I have it there and I can make modifications to it. Or if you know what you're doing and you're familiar with it, you could just make that config files and put whatever random stuff in there you
And
want.
that'll be exclusive for that directory, correct?
Yes. So. All right, so now I have this doxil.env file in there and this doxil.yml file. The YML file has the service configurations, and the env file just has environment variables, like what is the, do I want to set the actual URL for this website in there? I can modify that, the MySQL username and password, things like that. They're just environment variables that don't have anything to do with the compose.
You said you had Doxil already installed. That's when they already fetched containers you might be needing, like PHP, MySQL.
No, so having Doxil already installed means I already had VirtualBox set up and the VM and the software that is Doxil, which is a lot of scripts and things like that. If you tell it to use containers and it doesn't have them, it will go on the internet and get them. So you don't see a lot of stuff going on here because I already have these containers and they're like locally cached. But if I told it to get a container it doesn't already have it, you'll see a line that shows up and it'll go downloading, and it like does all that sort of stuff.
The one-time only thing. Next
Yeah, and then it holds on to them. And it's a Docker process that's doing that. So if you were doing things with Docker, it would do the exact same thing. If you told it to use an image it doesn't have, it would go to Docker Hub and get it.
So if you're using the fin command line tool, like you wouldn't be doing any normal Docker machine start stop commands. You just run that through the fin CLI.
For Docker start and stuff,
Yeah, is that
you
what fin
don't
is
need
doing?
to do that. It'll be running in persistent.
Okay.
And then the commands for start and stop are starting the services, so the actual containers themselves, and they essentially persist unless there's one that isn't set up to persist.
Okay.
So if you actually had some sort of execution container that was like designed just to like run a service and shut down, like execute a command, it would still do that. It would start up and then shut down.
So I noticed, I don't see any accommodation like the shared folder between the host and Docker. You don't have to mess around with any of
You
that?
don't need any of that. So
like
it's
the Mac
it's
doesn't-
mounting the directory that I'm in.
Okay.
So all the files that you need would be in this project directory. So that
Okay.
doc root that's there, that's part of your project directory, I would have like Drupal installed in that. Or if you wanted to, like if you're doing a composer-based workflow, like this could literally just have your composer JSON file in it, and you could tell Docker as part of that like init to do the composer install, and I do that on projects, and then it goes and gets everything and installs it and sets it all up and blah 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 blah.
And where does that get mounted? Inside the VM or inside the container?
Well, the container has access to the whole like directory that I'm in. That's already mounted there.
Where? Like in root?
So on my local
Bash?
on my local workstation, the home directory that I'm in is mounted in the virtual machine. So when the containers run, their var dub directory is the project directory that I'm in. So if I actually did fin bash and I went in there, I wouldn't see the govcon directory. The govcon directory would be var www. Or like var dub and then like the doc root directory and like its web servers running off of that. And you can change those things. So if you don't want your root to be doc root, you want it to be web or www or something else, you can actually change that in the config and tell it its doc root is going to be something else. All right, so here, if I do fin status, here's the services. So you can see the three are running and their state is up. And then if you just do fin, you can see the other commands you can do. So yeah, I can tell it to restart, check logs, do stuff with the config, do stuff with the VM. If you do bash, you log right in. If you do exec, it'll run any command that you tell it to run. So these are all essentially custom commands that are just common things we use, so we make them as part of fin. But you can make your own custom commands and fin will recognize them automatically. But if you just need to tell one of the containers to like do something, like in a bash script kind of way or whatever, like even when I echoed the index PHP file, I could have told the command container to do it. I could just say fin exec and then like do the echo and cat that into the index PHP or whatever. I could tell the container to do it. And sometimes that actually works better. So even though I have Composer locally on my laptop, it's better to tell the command container to do it, because the command container will have that consistent environment. So if I have to then do Composer install like on the dev server or somebody else's, we can ensure that they're all working the same way. And that kind of matters with like PHP versions and things like that, because Composer is using PHP. So I run into problems like that where like I run something locally and I'm like, Composer's not working right, and I tell the command container to do it. It's like, oh, it works fine. Because it's like it's got a newer version of PHP or something, because the Mac OS default version is really old. All right, anyway, so I wrote those two files. So you can see them here, Doxil env, Doxil.yml. So if I look at them at all, all right, so the env one is empty because it doesn't need anything. And then the YML one has that default config, which defines the services. Okay, I can show you another example. So I actually had PHP Storm open. I just wanted to show you like what some of these files look like. So this one actually has an env file that's for this demo project that I use. And you can see in here, I can actually set the virtual host name. So if I don't want it to be based on the directory that the project's in, I can just set this to something else. It doesn't really matter. All right, and then I can change the doc root to something else. I can change the MySQL username and password to something else. Like you can set all these things in here. And we actually have Xdebug support by default. This is actually another really great thing. You don't have to set up Xdebug at all. It's already built into the command container. So for any project, for me to get Xdebug to work, all I have to do is set Xdebug enabled to 1. In Chrome, I use the add-on that gives you like the little toolbar icon to use Xdebug. So I just enable that, set my breakpoint in PHP Storm, that's it. There's no configuration to make Xdebug working. When I first started doing it, like that alone was worth me switching to whatever I was doing to this, because Xdebug can be a pain to get set up and working. All right, so that's in the env file, and then, so I have this commands directory. Anything you put in this command directory, fin will recognize. So you make whatever custom things you want. That's what we do mostly on projects. So like, if we have some custom setup, we'll make an init file that's just a bash script, or you can make another one and have multiple, it doesn't matter. You put something in here, whatever the name of the file is, it automatically recognizes it as a command, and you can just run it. So if we look at our init that's in here, what I wanted to show you is that it's just a big bash script, and essentially you get to a point where you can see all it's doing is then just running drush commands. And that's how it like sets up the site and does stuff if you want it to do that. But you can modify this and make it do whatever you want. In our GitHub repo, we have examples of init commands and how you can do things and stuff like that. So it's pretty straightforward. And then once you're done, right, you can do then remove. So if you don't want this project anymore, it'll shut down the containers, it'll get rid of them, and that's it. So essentially you have 0 footprint. Anything related to this project is going to be in this project directory. So I just do remove. It shuts those containers down so that you don't need them anymore and that they're not running. With the persistent, so you can see it's stopping them. And then when I'm done, I just delete this directory and that's it. I don't have to do anything else. There's no like configuration, like you don't have to edit your host files. There's no like spider web of stuff on your system related to this project that you had to go screw around with. Everything is going to be in this directory. So once I remove the services, I can just delete the directory and it's completely gone. There's nothing related.
Will you break absolutely everything if you delete the directory without turning off the services?
No, because the services will still be running, but we have a cleanup command that can like, and externally you can tell fin recognizes all the containers that are running, because Docker does, so you can like, and you can just tell them to shut down. And then you can run a cleanup command that'll like delete images you don't need and things like that, and just get rid of stuff you don't have to. So like footprint-wise, it's like really, really minimal. And Doxil itself is actually really easy to get rid of too. You can just, it gets installed in your home directory. So if you're using the virtual machine, you can just delete it, get rid of the contain, tell it to like get rid of the containers first, and then delete that directory from the home directory, and like that's that. All right, so. If I did, I shut that down. I was going to show the share command. Let's see if I have something else wrong. Well, that's running. What I wanted to tell you is, of course, go to our GitHub repo. We have lots of stuff in here, so we have sample projects for like all kinds of different things that you might want, and half of them are not Drupal related. We do have an account, of course, on Docker Hub where we maintain images, but as I said, you don't have to use our images if you don't want to. You have to use our command container, though, for the most part, and it's the thing that does the work. There's no reason not to use that. We have a Gitter, so feel free to get access to that. We'd like to know if people are using it. If you're running into problems, let us know. The engineering team is in here, so we'll tell you, we'll try to help you out. We do have a document website that's on readthedocs.io. So all the documentation for all the different things you might need, setup, configurations, custom configurations, all that kind of stuff is in here. We're going to start blogging more on Medium, and this stuff will get linked on our website, doxil.io. Now let's see if this thing is running. It is running, so I have another website in here and another directory. If I run the share command, this is what I wanted to show you. It uses this service called ngrok that creates the pipeline to the internet. And then once I do this, it's up and running, the pipeline, so I can take this URL, give it to somebody else, and then they will access the website that's on my computer. And then when I'm done, I just shut it down, and it goes away, and it doesn't have to be exposed anymore. Nobody ever uses that. I would recommend if you're going to use that a lot, you probably need to actually go get a commercial account from ngrok because they throttle. So for the most part, you probably can't get more than one person to actually go visit the site, and it's just like too slow.
So the share thing looks really great. The reason why I'm sort of skeptical about using it is that usually the moment when I sort of have something ready to show someone is not the moment that they're ready to look at it. So the workflow that we've generally used is, when I get stuff to that point, I build an image and then I push it up onto OpenShift. And then I just sort of let the product owner know that it's up there.
Sure.
So do you have is there sort of a command for just kind of export this image so that I can push it someplace while you're working?
Internally, we do that stuff ourselves. So like we have build processes and pipeline tools that we use, like either like Bitbucket pipelines or through Acquia hosting or Circle CI and stuff like that. That's all unrelated to Doxil. It doesn't matter. So if you have like a Git repo and you commit it and you have a build process that takes that commits and builds a sandbox, that's fine. We do that all the time. The share is just something I might do like if I'm not at that point. So like if I'm working on something and I might need to show somebody else like, hey, I'm getting this like weird JavaScript error or something, can you look at it for me? Like I can actually let them see the site without having to like make commits and push a branch for them that they have to go check out and set up. They can just look in the web browser real quick.
I'm not really talking about a build process. I'm just wondering if you can capture the image or do Docker push up to a registry so that you can.
But there's nothing to capture. Like you don't need the containers. So what you would have is like, so in our process, we have servers that support Doxil. So when I make a commit, I can have that commit get pushed to that server that then essentially checks out the repo, and it has the .doxil directory, so it does like a fin up, and then the site is there, right? There's nothing in the container that you actually save. You just are pushing the configuration around. So if Doxil is located someplace, it uses that configuration to build the site, right? So there's no state that you have to save for the containers or the sites or anything like that.
Do you have any gotchas to warn us about that, but only use VM and then move over,
So the main gotcha, the problem that people always come to me about is they have a bunch of other stuff they use and like, oh, I'm having trouble getting set up. The thing that you have to know about with the virtual machines is that you can't put them in the same directory. So Doxil exports your entire home directory. If you are using something else like Drupal VM or whatever, and you're running it in your home directory and then try to set up Doxil, they can't export the same home directory. So I always tell people, if you're doing that, leave Doxil where it is, let it do its thing, it exports your entire home directory, your user home directory.
take Drupal VM and put it in another directory. So put it in like var ww on your Mac or whatever, and then when you start it up, it'll be fine. And they can both run at the same time, it doesn't matter. And that's the case for any other virtual machine. So I have like 5 or 6 virtual machines on my computer. They just all have to be in different directories when you start up because you can't export the same directory to them. You can't map the same directory to 2 different places. That's the main gotcha when people are trying to do installations.
Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know if there's any precautions or any notes about working with various hosts like Pantheon or Aqua?
So if you want to mimic a stack, that's easy to do. So this default config that I have essentially is a stack. We actually, if you look in the Doxil directory, you'll see we have an Acquia stack because we use Acquia a lot, and that like defines services that are like mimicking exactly the way Acquia's hosting works with like their memcache setup and varnish and things like that. If you wanted to make another one that mimics somebody else, you can do that. DreamHost or whatever, it doesn't matter. We've talked about making one for Pantheon. We don't at the moment because we don't have that many projects that use Pantheon. But if somebody wanted to make one and contribute it back, it's totally fine. It's
The ENV file had database credentials in there. Does that mean it should not be in your version control?
It doesn't really matter because that's going to be local. So when it sets up the containers, but you can do like local overrides. So you don't have to have those passwords in there if you don't want them. You can do something else, just like you would manage passwords, like pull in a file from another location or do something different. It doesn't really matter. We have that for convenience in the default, but it's mostly local. Oh, and I forgot to mention also, so these files you can commit. So like the doxil.yml and the doxil.env, but it also has support for local configuration. So you can make like a doxil.local.env that has local overrides and a doxil.local.yml that has local overrides. So if you had a different config that was just local to your laptop or whatever, it'll recognize that file, just like Drupal recognizes settings.local.php, and you can kind of do the exact same thing. It just automatically recognizes.
Would it make any sense to run Doxil on a server that you would stand up instances? Like
Yeah, it's totally fine. Like I said, we use that for like our development process when we commit something and we want to like check a sandbox and like run tests and stuff like that. We don't do it on production. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, just because a lot of it is just set up for development. Like on production, you might have like a very specific setup that you want, like for your hosting. But we have some people that are actually doing it in production because they want the exact same process the whole way, and they said it, for the most part it's working fine. But honestly, just for us as a company, we haven't done it because we mostly use like Acquia or other things, and so like we're not controlling that hosting anyway. And
If I've sent those remotely and I have them locally, is there any issue with, does it have to be the same flavor?
no, it shouldn't matter.
Do you know what version of Docker you're using? Because like in the later version, secret is available. I don't know if that's something that we can use to leverage encryption.
I don't know off the top of my head what version it's using. I'm sure it's whatever the latest is because we continue to chase Docker. So whenever they have a new release, we tend to update whatever it is. I don't know what the exact version number is off the top of my head though. It would be easy to check.
I'm wondering if they have any workflow suggestions for a situation where you sort of want to have 2 different branches of the same project running at once. I'm often working on a branch, and I sort of pause to sort of look at what another developer is doing. And so, kind of the project name, Doxil, what would be really awesome is if I could do sort of branch name Doxil or something like that. Just wondering if anyone sort of thought about that. Or if you just kind of swap them out.
Yeah, I mean, usually what I do is I have the Git repo checked out, and then I just switch to the other branch, and then do like init to reinit the site.
So you just spin up the containers for that branch as you need them.
Yeah, but the containers don't change. So I think you're kind of like getting in a mindset where you think the containers matter that much when they really don't. Because if you're working on different branches, you're working on the software. You're not, for the most part, manipulating things that are in the container configuration. Most of the time, if I switch branches, I don't even like reinit. It's just like slight software change or like CSS changes or something like that. But you could also check out a branch as just another project and just give it another name.
It's the database rebuild on different branches because our deployment strategy is to use features and DB updates. updates, right? So if another developer is working on something, you need to set the database back to a known state and redo that process. That's the sort of cycle.
Right, so that's why like I often do the init, because the init is handling that build, so I can then switch back to what I was doing and then do it again if I wanted to, or if it was getting too complicated like the data, like I might just check that out as another project if you need to keep it that way. But yeah, like I do things that, like I need to test that the database update works, right? So like I'll check out that other code, reinitialize the site at a certain state. I can do that if I have like that database and then run the updates and stuff. I'm like, it's fairly easy to actually go back and forth and do different things like that. It's usually not too complicated, and it's fast enough in what it imports and builds that it's usually like a minute or something to do that kind of stuff. But I mean, if you end up with something like some complicated use case and there's a way to solve it, like go into Gitter and open up an issue and we'll talk about it.